Okay, so this is the second video that I'm going to do on the different forms of government intervention. This one is indirect taxation. As before then, we really need to think about the aim of indirect taxation. So the aim for a government, whenever it is using indirect taxation, is to reduce production and consumption of a good. So in economic terms, that is the primary aim. What we also have to remember, though, is that in political terms, and also more macro terms, we also need to bear in mind that taxation is also used to raise government revenue, even the indirect form of taxation, so taxes on products and so on, things like that, and need to bear in mind that although the primary function, certainly in Econ 1, is to think about the impact on production and consumption, we do also need to consider the impact on government revenue of a tax as well. So the next thing we need to do then is consider what sorts of failure we would attack with this policy. So if we've got indirect taxation and we're aiming to reduce production or consumption, that implies that we have a situation in the free market of overproduction or overconsumption. So what may cause each of those? Well, overproduction will be caused by producing a good which generates negative production externalities. And I suppose your classic one here would be pollution externalities or noise externalities, or overconsumption. If something is overconsumed, then we talk about it being a demerit good. So, and remembering as well that a demerit might mean that it has negative consumption externalities, or costs which are not fully considered. So in the case of alcohol or tobacco, something like that, for instance, the damage to your health which is not being fully considered. So let's think about how they would actually work. So let's think about how we would demonstrate an indirect tax on a market diagram. So as we are hopefully getting fairly used to, we are going to start off with our standard micro diagram. So price and quantity on the axes, supply and demand labelled clearly on the curves, and then our market equilibrium position. And remember as well that in our market failure, it's always better to emphasise that the demand and supply are the private costs and benefits. So what effect is a tax going to have? Well, the main thing to remember here is that the tax that the government imposes here is going to be passed on through the firms. So the government will actually impose the tax on the firm, and the firm will pass it on to the consumer. There's a tendency in the pressure of the exam, when you're thinking about it too fast, to assume that because the government imposes tax on, say, cigarettes, that actually that's going to affect demand in some way, and that's incorrect. You don't show a tax by shifting the demand curve. It's going to affect a firm, and what it's going to do is it's going to affect the firm's costs of production. So what it will do is it will increase the costs of production of the firm. So what we're talking about here is increasing these private costs to the firm of producing this good. Now, if we increase the costs of production through tax, it would work exactly the same way as if the cost of production went up through wage increase or anything else. What will happen is that we will end up with a shift of supply to the left, like this. In actual fact, we normally talk about this being a shift upwards of supply by the amount of the tax. What would then happen as a result of that is that the market price of the good would increase as the firms pass on some of those costs to the consumer. More importantly, though, as far as what we're trying to achieve here, the level of production and consumption of this good will fall from Q to Q1. Now, if you remember, we said that we would use a tax in a situation where there was overproduction or overconsumption of this good. So if we successfully manage to reduce the level of production and consumption with a tax, which is what this diagram shows, then that means that hopefully Q1 will be closer to the social optimum position than Q was, and therefore the tax here will have hopefully reduced the according to this diagram, it will have reduced the negative impact of the overproduction and overconsumption market failure. One final extra point that we need to be aware of with indirect taxes is that there are actually two forms of indirect tax which a government may apply, and these are shown in the two diagrams here. Diagram on the left shows us a flat rate tax, diagram on the right shows us an ad valorem tax. Now, the key difference here, as you may well have spotted, is that on the flat rate tax, the shift in supply is parallel. In the ad valorem tax, the shift in supply is not parallel. The flat rate tax means that the amount of tax applied is the same for every unit sold. So that means that this unit down here, the tax, which is the vertical distance there, is the same as it is on these units, which are kind of much higher level of output. So the amount of tax applied on this sort of thing is exactly the same. For instance, this would be saying that there is a tax of 10p on each, for instance, can of Coke that was bought if the government decided to do that. So there'll be a tax of 10p on each can of sugary soft drink that was bought. It would mean that the supply curve would shift up in parallel like that. An ad valorem tax, though, means that the tax is a percentage of the selling price. That's what the ad valorem means, which means if it's down here and it would have been selling for a very low price, then the amount of tax is quite low. As you move higher and higher and higher in the output and in the prices, the level of the tax gets greater and greater. So these ad valorem taxes are taxes which are a percentage of the selling price. So two different sorts of tax which the government can use. They will use them ideally depending on the nature of the externality, but that's getting a little bit further ahead than we actually need to. You do, though, need to be aware of the difference between a flat rate and an ad valorem tax, and these two diagrams show the difference.